Hello everyone, today we talk about a canonic, classic, evergreen battle in the history of mankind, the one of Marathon, fought in 490 BC, one of the most momentous engagements in history, like not just in the Hellenic and the Achaemenid one, not just for its immediate military outcome, but also for its long-term political and strategic implications. Today, this video is the tactical analysis that I routinely engage in, especially bringing in as many primary sources as possible, but the Battle of Marathon has this enormous privilege of being told essentially as the fundamental primary source by Herodotus, the so-called father of history. Then, of course, there are some gaps in the narrative, some aspects about the strategical and tactical situation that you need sort of to research into various different hints, other sources of whatever. But that fundamentally, revolves around the Herodotan narrative that, for this reason, we will explicitly read directly from the entirety, and then passing to the analysis, the criticism of this battle. I don't pretend to be original or innovative. I mean, sometimes on YouTube you encounter these content creators that all of a sudden found, the alternative way this battle actually went. It's all a scam, whatever. Not just Marathon, but there are actually pretty close and recent references I could make, and inexplicably people are gullibly as ignorant enough to actually buy this notion and thinking that, especially such engagements, there are others that are not properly studied, that they have not even heard of in spite of the overwhelming importance, but that these ancient battles that notoriously are told just by a bunch of sources, in this case really just by one, can be fundamentally rewritten on through who knows what, right? Whether it's archaeology or computers in some ways, and this is the unfortunate state of cultural illiteracy in which we live today. Not that it's ever been this great, but let's say that YouTube and other social media are taking some turns exemplifying what we well know as the a radical collapse in IQ that the world is going under since the 1970s. In any case, minimal political and strategic background to the Battle of Marathon. Of course, we're witnessing the Persian expansion of the Achaemenid Empire under King Darius I that was aggressively extending its domination. By the mid first millennium BC, the Achaemenid control extended from Anatolia to Egypt with ambitions to further extend into Hellas. The Persians had already conquered the Hellenic polis of Ionia, is more or less, as you know, modern-day western Anatolian coast in Turkey, which led, in fact, to the famous also Ionian revolt of 499, supported by some Hellenic polis like Athens in the Hellenic, say, mainland rather than motherland. So Hellas at this time was not a unified nation, but a collection of independent city-states, like, in fact, Athens and Sparta, often in conflict with each other, but sharing a common Hellenic identity and culture. The Ionian revolt, although ultimately unsuccessful, had stirred a sense of solidarity among some Hellenes against the Achaemenid rule, one of the truly Catholic ecumenic empire within which the same Hellenes had fundamentally been developing, and we will talk about this in other videos. In any case, the momentous background here of the Athenian regime, like the so-called democratic one, which is actually a misnomer, having recently moved at least from tyranny to more popular government under Clisthenes. We are during 508 and 7 reforms of the former ruler, and this political development made Athens a symbol of freedom and autonomy, contrasting sharply with the Achaemenid monarchic autocracy. So following the suppression of the Ionian revolt, Darius sought to punish Athens and Eretria for their support. This was not just about revenge, but also about securing the Aegean Sea by controlling its western shores, thus ensuring smoother maritime routes and reducing threats to Achaemenid interests. It was Xerxes' expedition would be more monumental and sort of more decisive in the broader picture. But Darius' one was also really an incredible feat. Darius sent an expeditionary force led by his generals Datis and Artaphernes to punish Athens and Eretria. The Achaemenids first sacked Eretria, then moved towards Athens. Marathon was selected for several strategic reasons. The landing site, which provided a suitable beach for landing an army from the sea, with the plain of Marathon offering space for cavalry operations. Proximity to Athens, close enough to threaten the city directly, but far enough to avoid immediate reinforcements from the polis. In the terrain, the area's geography could potentially be used to the advantage of either side depending on the tactics that today we're going to analyze. Thus, in accordance with the title, this video will focus solely on the Battle of Marathon, primarily based on Herodotus' narrative, while also attempting to clarify certain aspects and fill in any gaps. It's not like we know 100% what actually happened, but this is also, as I was saying before, part of the very widely known historiographical criticism about the battle that also becomes mythological in itself, right? Which is what really most people do not really have clear. This stuff has been studied ever since it happened, right? So there's not much of a creativity about the various options and the, say, historical plausibilities about the battle. However, there are certain aspects that can be highlighted that can be very didactic as far as hoplite warfare is concerned. There are, again, because I always have to make disclosure by addressing certain pop notions that are you're being constantly fed with, at least you're bombarded every time you enter YouTube and the homepage of things like the hoplitic heresy, this were stuff that were invented in a time which we knew all throughout more or less how Hellenic warfare worked, and just some scholars decided to self-referentially pretend that the entire historiography revolved around their post-Vietnam traumatized anti-Malay kind of structuralistic deterministic notion of how war should be fought, and basically the ensuing historiography just even more self-referentially just pretended that this was the greatest problem ever put out in historiography that you can simply bypass by having studied with, of course, like a significant historical background and expertise, but just studying, in fact, every single campaign and battle, and acquiring that sort of sensitivity that is the only way at the end of the day, through also the sense of authority and competence, in order to explain what Hellenic warfare really worked like, right? And since it's the Greeks, right, this was overly enhanced with fireworks, like, oh my god, it's so important because this is at the root of our Western civilization. So this is a topic that we must overly emphasize, even if it's just about the heretic derailment of some, isolated and incompetent scholars, whereas every person with a minimal of strategic education and military historical notion will have actually already sorted out by itself, right? So we will always find the genius that has to explain to you how the Hellenic hoplites actually fought as if, other people didn't know, and that's actually the first indicator of how much this person has no clue whatsoever about what is actually out there and how much has been written, and far beyond the issue of the hoplitic heresy, so-called, that is objectively one of the least interesting topics that you can address, because it's just, explaining the fixing of how some people decided to mess up history that has nothing to do with history. In any case, let's simply read Herodotus, given that we have this utmost privilege of essentially studying this battle from such primary source that is really speaking volumes about, of course, the Athenian political, military, and social background. This was a time in history which literally everybody knew in Athens, say, the names of those who had fallen in the battle, for example. And this is something you don't have, in Hellenistic times, where the soldiers are illiterate are proper soldiers, by the way. There are much bigger and important battles, at least in strictly military terms, but we also know dramatically less. So let's start Book 6 from 109 onwards. Now the opinions of the generals of the Athenians were divided, and the one party urged that they should not fight a battle, seeing that they were too few to fight with the army of the Maids, while the others, and among them Miltiades, advised that they should do so. And when they were divided, and the war's opinion was like to prevail, then, since he who had been chosen by lot to be Polemarch of the Athenians had a vote in addition to the 10, for in old times the Athenians gave the Polemarch an equal vote with the generals, and at that time the Polemarch was Callimachus, of the dame of Aphidnae. To him came Miltiades, and said as follows: With thee now it rests, Callimachus, either to bring Athens under slavery, or by making her free, to leave behind thee for all the time that men shall live a memorial, such as not even Harmodius and Aristogeiton have left. For now the Athenians have come to a danger, the greatest to which they have ever come since they were a people. And on the one hand, if they submit to the Maids, it is determined what they shall suffer, being delivered over to Hippias, while on the other hand, if the city shall gain the victory, it may become the first of the cities of Hellas. How this may happen, and how it comes to thee, of all men, to have the decision of these matters, I am now about to tell. Of us, the generals, who are 10 in number, the opinions are divided, the one party urging that we fight a battle, and the others that we do not fight. Now, if we do not, I expect that some great spirit of discord will fall upon the minds of the Athenians, and so shake them that they shall go over to the Maids. But if we fight battle before any unsoundness appear in any part of the Athenian people, then we are able to gain the victory in the fight, if the gods grant equal conditions. These things then all belong to thee and depend on thee. For if thou attack thyself to my opinions, thou hast both a fatherland which is free and native, and a native city which shall be the first among the cities of Hellas. But if thou choose the opinion of those who are earnest against fighting, thou shalt have the opposite of those good things of which I told thee. Thus speaking, Miltiades gained Callimachus to his side, and the opinion of the Polemarch being added, it was thus determined to fight a battle. After this, those generals whose opinion was in favor of fighting, as the turn of each one of them to command, for the day came around, gave over their command to Miltiades, and he, accepting it, would not, however, yet bring about a battle until his own turn to command had come. And when it came round to him, then the Athenians were drawn up for battle, in the order which here follows. On the right wing the Polemarch Callimachus was leader, for the custom of the Athenians then was this, that the Polemarch should have the right wing, and he leading. Next after him came the tribes, in order as they were numbered one after another, and last were drawn up the Plataeans, occupying the left wing. For ever since this battle, when the Athenians offer sacrifices in the solemn assemblies which are made at the 4 yearly festivals, the herald of the Athenians prays thus, quote, that blessing may come to the Athenians and to the Plataeans both. On this occasion, however, when the Athenians were being drawn up at Marathon, something of this kind was done, their army being made equal in length of front to that of the Maids, came to drawn up in the middle with a depth of but few ranks, and here their army was weakest, while each wing was strengthened with numbers. And when they had been arranged in their places, and the sacrifices proved favorable, then the Athenians were let go, and they set forth at a run to attack the barbarians. Now the space between the armies was not less than 8 furlongs, and the Persians, seeing them advancing to the attack at a run, made preparations to receive them. And in their minds they charged the Athenians with madness, which must be fatal, seeing that they were few, and yet were pressing forwards at a run, having neither cavalry nor archers. Such was the thought of the barbarians, but the Athenians, when all in a body they had joined in combat with the barbarians, fought in a memorable fashion. For they were the first of all the Hellenes about whom we know who went to attack the enemy at a run, and they were the first also who endured to face the Median garments and the men who wore them, whereas up to this time the very name of the maids was to the Hellenes a terror to hear. Now, while they fought in Marathon, much time passed by, and in the center of the army where the Persians themselves and the Sacans were drawn up, the barbarians were winning. Here, I say, the barbarians had broken at the ranks of their opponents and were pursuing them inland. But on both wings, the Athenians and Plataeans severally were winning the victory. In being victorious, they left that part of the barbarians which had been routed to fly without molestation, and bringing together the two wings, they fought with those who had broken their center, and the Athenians were victorious. So they followed after the Persians as they fled, slaughtering them until they came to the sea. And then they called for fire and began to take hold of the ships. In this part of the work was slain the Polemarch Callimachus, after having proved himself a good man. And also one of the generals, Stesilaus, the son of Thrasylaus, was killed. And besides, this Cynegairos, the son of Euphorion, while taking hold there of the ornament at the stern of a ship, had his hand cut off with an axe and fell, and many others also of the Athenians who were men of note were killed. 7 of the ships the Athenians got possession of in this manner, but with the rest of the barbarians pushed off from land, and after taking the captives from Eretria off the island where they had left them, they sailed round Sunium, purposing to arrive the city before the Athenians. And an accusation became current among the Athenians to the effect that they formed this design by contrivance of the Alcaemonidae. For these, it was said, having concerted matters with the Persians, displayed to them a shield when they had now embarked in their ships. This then, I say, were sailing around Sunium, and meanwhile the Athenians came to the rescue back to the city as speedily as they could, and they arrived there before the barbarians came, and having arrived from the temple of Heracles at Marathon, they encamped at another temple of Heracles, namely that which is in Kynosarges. The barbarians, however, came and lay with their ships in the sea which is of Phaleron, for this was then the seaport of the Athenians. They anchored their ships, I say, off this place, and then proceeded to sail back to Asia. In this fight at Marathon there were slain of the barbarians about 6,400 men, and of the Athenians 192. Such was the number which fell on both sides. And it happened also that a marvel occurred there of this kind. An Athenian, Epizelus, the son of Guphagorus, while fighting in the close combat and proving himself a good man, was deprived of the sight of his eyes, neither having received a blow in any part of his body, nor having been hit with a missile. And for the rest of his life, from this time he continued to be blind. And I was informed that he used to tell about that which had happened to him, a tale of this kind, namely that it seemed to him that a tall man in full armor stood against him, whose beard overshadowed his bow shield. And this apparition passed him by, but killed his comrade who stood next to him. Thus, as I was informed, Epizelus told the tale. So, as you understand, we do not know too much. There is also a bit of background to this, which has been, however, thoroughly reconstructed mostly through scattered, of course, chronological and topographical references, but mostly also with geography of the place. Also, the map I use here is, I'm not even sure I'm going to use it because at least we do know how the battle went. There are other battles that sort of we know much less about in terms of location and deployment. Here, the terrain is important mostly from a strategical point of view. Like, we do not fully know where, we'll see now, like, the various armies were actually located, but there is some general military logical say criticism that you can appreciate regarding like the choices, like the likely conditions also that these armies really found themselves to have. I haven't made a premise, that is to say, one of the earliest videos I ever made was about the campaign, if I'm not wrong, probably also about the Battle of Marathon. Today, however, it was a long time ago, so it's good to remake the entire thing in a sense, because the battle is relatively simple, but again, you do need a bit of this criticism and sophistication to fully appreciate it in its military relevance. And especially, again, from a tactical point of view, also for the sake of the reconstruction of the Hellenic and Achaemenid warfare of the time, that is, in fact, not to be given for granted, rather than thinking how many centimeters, like hoplites were spaced. Look, there is so much more, right, that opens your mind when you actually read this text. So let's dive into the battle. Having read what Herodotus said, and there are some other data from the same author that were written before, but these are so well known that, generally speaking, there is no need even to cite them back in the work. In any case, the battle was fought on the morning of September the 11th. When you look at the map, you notice that the Hellenic forces are strategically positioned in the southern entrance of the Marathon plain, near, as we've seen, the Temple of Heracles, much of an omen, either along the main road to Athens or perhaps, we're not sure, taking cover in the nearby hills. As we'll learn now, the point is that the Achaemenid army, regardless of what people generally think, was actually more advanced than the Hellenic one. Where what happened during the Persian wars at large is not much the product of any strict technical superiority from the Hellenic side, right? The story of, I don't know, bronze over lighter troops, or kind of this technologistic determinism. It is all about moral forces, right? And here, the Greeks do not have the upper hand at all. They are the weaker side, right? And the Achaemenids are much better at combined arms. They are more articulated. The Greeks at large fight with heavy infantry, thus they do not have much cavalry or missile troops, and they have to be very careful, so along the way before they're deployed, not to fall into ambushes and more. The Athenian army consisted of roughly 9,000 to 10,000 hoplites, with approximately 900 to 1,000 from each of the 10 tribes that we've seen constituting the polis population. They were soon bolstered by about 10,000 allied hoplites, as we've seen from Plataea. Miltiades and Callimachus established the typical phalanx formation that was, however, we noticed this in Herodotus, narrow in the center, which was unusual. The author stresses, likely incorporating units from a couple of tribes are arranged in 4 ranks. We will see the deployment a bit more mathematically in depth later, if anything for schematic clarity, while still maintaining a standard depth of 8 ranks on the flanks instead, right? So you have this symmetric formation in which, however, the center, you have the wings that have the usual phalangitic depth, which is also shared, telling the truth, by other peoples. Here, again, we shouldn't, say, hypothesize that the phalanx as something categorically different from how other heavy infantries in the ancient world, by this point, fought. Made lots of videos about also the Argos panoply, how, in fact, the hoplitic tactics were, as we intend them, at least came to be, which was never, in fact, fluid process, right? That is also what, of course, the critiques to the hoplitic heresy like stress. But again, we do not need to talk about the heresy at all, given that we more or less already knew how the picture is. Yet, again, this line in the center is thin, and the wings are standard. And the reason is that, as we've seen, the Greeks want to meet the Persians with the same width of the enemy army, right? They do not want, in other words, to be outflanked by a more mobile enemy. And they count on essentially breaking actually on the same wings and destroying the enemy formation in kind. We'll see now all the difficulties at the time. What is very important to remember when analyzing these battles is that, say, while we are very lucky to have this kind of accounts, we're truly the first, say, historiographical ones, right, debatably so, but really providing us with that typically and very sort of modernly Hellenic mentality, enough sort of rationale and analysis of the situation, really refer to very archaic and primitive times. As we just said, the Greeks did not really have much of an overall development in the art of war. They fought in sort of very primitive, also largely amatorial ways, given the, say, more or less in fact, popular unprofessional substratum of the polis communities that, as you know, had emerged also a bit against this idea of autocracy of the, say, the war chariots, the noblemen, the so-called tyrants, right? So there are just so many or few things that you can do with an army like this that does not have a great deal, as we've seen, of combined armed tactics. Actually, it sort of doesn't, right? While it is true that cavalry and missile warfare in classical Hellenic times has been a bit downplayed, objectively, the Hellenic armies were constitutively about heavy infantry and not practically anything else that you can count as a fully fledged army, at least at this point, especially at this point. Now, later it would be different. I made lots of videos about Hellenic cavalry for that matter, so we will come back on that at some point. There isn't this at Marathon, even though naturally these narratives can be overlooking a bit that dimension as well, for reasons that are important to understand, being much more almost chivalric in mentality, even in the rank and file Athenian citizen that, yes, may have been an amateur warfare, but was literally obsessed in Achilles' psychopathy and literally had this sense of, one of the few things that HEMA reenactment are good for, like in showing that basically every idiot can't get himself killed by charging into an enemy, which has really nothing to do with, handling warfare in more competent terms. And so, like, mostly the average person level of military historical analysis is that there are people that are courageous and others aren't. Every human being can be thrown into the meat grinder, and this is what the entirety of military history shows. One thing is that, one thing is actually, doing something strategic about it, which requires, in fact, lots of other qualities, right? So the reason why, however, you may not hear too much about missile or cavalry, etc., is not just the fact that objectively they weren't there as a fully fledged army, but that this historiography feels really that free citizenry is a sort of traditional nobility to a degree, at least in the sense in which that freedom equated to some capacity to defend the same in arms, right, by the side of these communities, hence all the pride and hence all the sort of snobbish attitude towards people were technically unfree, right, because especially the lighter troops would be not citizens, and so that's also another side of the story, but bear it in mind, hence also this, as we've seen, this great interest, even in individual exploit, in the commanders, in also, as you've seen, the description of the barbarians are very interesting. This guy is equipped with this massive man, like Goliaths with axes, beards. Like it's really important to picture here, because even though Darius' army was not so multi-ethnic, let's say, as Xerxes' one, still, it was still the product of the Achaemenid Empire that, as we recalled at the beginning, is immense and brings lots of these different peoples, as we've seen with Exarchus, for example, explicitly on the battlefield, right? Now, As we were saying about the Hellenic deployment, this configuration adopted allowed for the front line of the Hellenic phalanx to match the length of their opponents, extending approximately 1,500 meters. Although a phalanx could face a foe with an extended front, risking encirclement, this innovative tactic of thinning the center to mitigate the risk was unique for its time. It's a basic, fundamental, almost geometrical military logic, but again, in fact, it has not much to do with, say, internal line. It has to do with the moral quality of the troops. Can these thin lines hold against an enemy like the Persians? And what does, for example, maintaining the line, a line of such width in the advance, right? That we've seen it just recently, for example, in the video about the linear tactics and all the difficulties that even professional armies in the early modern age had in sort of fully developing that capacity of maintaining alignment of these entire forces. Imagine this among de facto amateurs at the beginning of the 5th century BC, right? This is not easy. This is not an easy enterprise for really anybody involved in many ways, and especially the Greeks are doing this for the first time, which takes an enormous amount of courage, determination, intelligence, and while the best way to come out of this alive, not really a guarantee that would happen at all. Otherwise, a battle would have not been fought in the first place, right? So here, obviously, the Athenians have a chance to crush the Persians before they can further reinforce, and we will see now also some aspect about like why is this battle taking place exactly at this point, right? Where was, for example, the enemy cavalry? Why it wouldn't encircle? This is the big question, as you know, about the Battle of Marathon. And in fact, chances are that the Greeks were to fight against an enemy that likely had most of its cavalry concentrated somewhere else off the battlefield map, let's put it in these terms, because of the foraging necessities of the Persian army, but also some orders that may have, in fact, been given within the Persian command in ways that we do not know and just out of a choice of a chance. The Achaemenids, from their side, also are pressured evidently, and they are forced to confront the Greeks. Herodotus offers limited details, as we have seen, regarding the formation and strength of the Achaemenid forces. We know very few about them, and they are arguably also the most interesting, because again, their army was more complex, was habituated to perform more complex tactics than the Hellenic ones. It is known that the core of the Achaemenid force consisted of Persians and Scythians, that is, the sagas of the source. This is interesting in general because the earlier the time and also the general character of the Persian forces is steps influenced by some degree. We know that the sagas would always be fielded during the Persian wars, also the ones against Alexander, by the Achaemenids. In any case, given that the Hellenes had adjusted their formation to match the Persians, it's probable that the Persian numbers significantly outmatched the Hellenic ones, which is also suggested by the final losses that, if Herodotus is correct about, would have been 6,400, and thus likely, not even most of the Achaemenid force that, as we've seen, was able in part to embark on the various ships that the Athenians had not been able to take. Of course, the majority, and in this, the problem here was that the Persians had moored their fleet in with a pretty marshy area in the front, and if anything, they had just a thin coastal corridor to eventually jump the ships, and in part this could even favor most of the ships actually to be salvaged to begin with, because the Greeks could have not immediately just pierced through even this escaping enemies with some of them already on board. In fact, as you see, significant fight takes place at the ships as well, with also significant Hellenic losses. If you read the account, as we did, you realize that most of the victims that Herodotus talks about from the Hellenic side occurred later, paradoxically after the Achaemenid army had been broken, for the major reason that Hellenic hoplites were not as skilled into hand-to-hand fighting, given that they had essentially broken the formation to pursue the Persians. We will also understand the psychology of this. That instead were much better as individual fighters at large. They had a more warlike background also of tribesmen, of these guys, as you see how individually and sort of designed they are as military types, right? Now, the Achaemenid military, for what we know, we made multiple videos about it, was organized into decimal formations. They were arranged in groups of 10 with regiments, we could say, known as the Azarabam, indicating, in fact, the thousands, in fact, made up of 1,000 soldiers, and divisions, so bigger units, the Baivarabam, meaning, in fact, tens of thousands, consisting of 10,000 soldiers. It may be a bit more complicated than this, but overall it does make sense. Essentially, the individual town are true regiments, whereas these divisions are essentially battle lines. They're working here, as you understand it, 10,000. There are as many as the Greeks in that single force. As a result, the Achaemenid Arstibara, that is to say the spearmen in the center, would hold a substantial numerical advantage over their direct adversaries, numbering 10 to 4. We say this, and this is explained in historiography also through the broader strategic situation, as we calculated the Achaemenid forces at 18,000 men. Right. The notion is, in fact, that the triremes that the Achaemenids employed for the invasion of Hellas were 600 triremes. By the way, you talked a bit about ancient ships of the era. We'll come back, especially on Achaemenid ones. And the idea is that, for transporting, like a trireme had a crew, a maximum crew of around 200 men, right? So if we make 600 per 200, we would have 120,000 men, which is just the maximum, and we know there were likely much less. In any case, in order to carry 30, 40 infantrymen, a trireme had to reduce the number of sailors to 60, bringing its crew to 80, 90 men, and this would reduce the essentially the maximum size of the expedition to 54,000 sailors and 18,000 fighters. Hence, we think that essentially 18,000 was the actual size of the overall Achaemenid army. All right, and you can make other calculations. For example, some of these triremes had to be empty, so the Persians may have been even less than that. Also, you have to account, there's, I don't know, maybe for a 1,000 horsemen force, as we will see now, there were the Sakas plus the Persian horsemen. You would need 100 triremes. Some authors even increasing this number, but making simply, in fact, a pretty naive equation by considering just the number of horses physically, spatially fitting into a trireme, which is very different from a military unit that would require much larger space for the same horsemen, for all what you need to feed them, all the various tools and material. So as we've seen, the Bayvarabam is the Persian division, 10,000 men. It would fit this this scale of Achaemenid invasion, right? And so you can make different estimates about how the rest of the Achaemenid force would be composed by. So it's possible that the Persians had a, let's say, a 1 to 10 cavalry to infantry ratio. I think is it can be a personal estimate, but if you look at other Persian armies of the time, we'll talk more about their organization. It's plausible. You would have this Saka troops that would also count lots of horse archers or archers in general. So you can account 2,000 of them. Plus, you have Hippias, Hellenic hoplites that, as we've seen, sided with the Persians. And so we can count 4,000 to 5,000 Ionian and Aeolian hoplites, to which perhaps another thousands of mercenary ones would join the Persians, especially during the incursions of the Achaemenid fleets in the Hellenic islands. Then we can imagine actually other ethnicities in the army: Syrians, Assyrians, Armenians, Cappadocians. So this is purely speculative because we do not have, not purely, but we, in a strictly historical sense, we do not have any explicit evidence of this. It's just a broader theory that we can create in the absence of more concrete evidence from what we indirectly know from how an average Achaemenid army would be constituted at this time. So going back to the Hellenic Achaemenid strength ratio along the line, by the way, that, as we've seen, is different. You have this center likely constituted by the Bayvarabam of 10,000 facing the thin part of the Hellenic line, 2 to 5 ratio compared to the Achaemenid center numbers in front of them. It's possible, my reconstruction, I don't know, I want to see, for example, the Saka archers on the front line of the Achaemenid forces. That's the missile element. Then you have to consider the wings being constituted by other, say, I don't know, hoplitic forces, as we've seen from the Hellenic, the pro-Achaemenid Hellenic partisans, plus the Persian cavalry and other infantry, which, as we understand here, would essentially fight against the hoplites, because we do not have, in fact, a mention of cavalry. And it's, in fact, possible that here the Achaemenid cavalry was at large not around. This is the main criticism that we will understand now, that also shows you how lucky, in a sense, or at least good the Greeks were in this choice, even though you may not know whether this foraging cavalry can come back, whether the Achaemenids have set up an ambush of some sort. So it's always a risky decision, and it's very complicated, to say the least, to see clearly at that time in those conditions. But one thing at a time. Traditionally, the Scythians, we know that. We also made a video about Scythian warfare back in the day and further sort of looked at it. Served as archers. They would typically serve as archers. They would have a narrow elite of heavies, but most of it would be missile. And it's likely, again, that they positioned themselves in front of the Achaemenid lines as skirmishers rather than on the flanks, if especially the latter were mostly, say, arrayed in a way that would have hopefully tried to outflank the hoplites, and or needed, in this sense, a more punching capacity. So it's likely that the center, constituted by the Persian division, would have needed to stop, like, the Hellenic the Hellenic impetus that, as we've seen, was also exceptionally carried out right? Exceptionally as successfully, which makes it still exceptional in that very sense. I mean, the Greeks, even Herodotus says here, had never sort of run. Here, intending, of course, like the phalanx, right? This infantry force, like to meet the enemy because of the obvious problems that we recalled before: lack of satisfactory collective training, the lack of necessity to do so, because up to this point they would have mostly fought other Greeks that didn't have all these combined arms, and therefore wouldn't put too much haste at the beginning of the battle in harassing, for example, your own front line. So the sense is the enemy has a lot of archers. Here you have to gap the line between the heavy infantry in order not to suffer casualties in the meanwhile. And as we've seen, like the Greeks are not really even in numerical advantage likely, and they are pretty nervous about the Persians in many ways. This is also Athens' force largely. So Herodotus explained that if Athens falls, basically Hellas loses it all, and or also here, which the Athenians of course looked very much forward to, was the chance to become the first polis in Hellas, due to the prestige that a victory over the Medes would have provided them. So you understand how much was at stake, also beyond the fact that you can simply get slaughtered and your city be destroyed. You have all the reasons for this fight, and it's also a simple, again, but difficult situation. Von Clausewitz explains this. War is actually very simple. It's just hard, which is a different thing. Going back to the Achaemenid forces, as we observed, there is little information also regarding the troops on the wings. One might speculate only that there could have been supportive hoplites sympathetic to Hippias, or those recruited by Datis and Artapherners from the Ionian and Aetolian islands during the naval incursions among the Hellenic islands, which may explain their lackluster performance in battle. The sense is also that the Achaemenids are the chosen people of God, and so they deserve the center, the greater glory of this all. It doesn't make any sense to fight in depth, because if you have this overwhelming force and the enemy fights also in a single line, you just want to overwhelm them in that interest. Otherwise you give them sort of the chance of simply overwhelming your entire force. And again, there's not a massive numerical disparity, but the Achaemenids are consistently more than the Greeks. Herodotus indirectly suggests that the Hellenes encountered hoplites during the battle, when he narrates, as we've seen, the story of this Epizzelos, who lost his sight while engaging a large bearded hoplite, who then killed 2 of his comrades. This is important because it shows lots of things regarding, of course, how, and we've seen it in our series about the late Bronze and early Iron Age Levantine warfare, a lot of actually heavy infantry from in the Near East that would have also contributed to the development of hoplitism in Hellas itself. Think about the Assyrian panoplies. It's apparently the Urartians that bring west the very similar features to the ones we see in the Argos panoply. That is often connected with probably the genesis of hoplitism in a conceptual sense. And so you have to be aware of these. Like, these are not simply lighter forces, as we generally speak, also like to stereotype a bit the Oriental horde whatsoever. The Persians, again, were a hell of a military culture. They had an incredibly advanced civilization, and they were superior to the Greeks in strictly tactical terms. Just that doesn't mean you will win all the time, and probably something went wrong also, because in fact they couldn't quite fully deploy all the might of their especially combined armed tactics. against the Hoplitic phalanx. Epizellos' episode is also interesting because it would be symptomatic of post-traumatic stress disorder. This guy basically lost his sight, not because of a physical injury, but because of a moral shock just looking at the enemy heavy infantryman here that had this enormous beard. And and imagine this in the context of the time, in the traditional sense of manifestation, transfiguration in holy combat, like the sense that in the midst of the fray, like all the forces of evil would unleash basically the darkest fears, etc., and just individual heroes would stand out like this aura of power and the capacity of, in fact, crushing the enemy just by not even hitting him, like in this case, for which this guy loses consciousness just looking at this enemy. So this is amazing because it gives you this perspective into not just what happens to a person who goes under such a trauma, but the nature of the trauma itself. That is something that we tend to simply detach from the realm of spiritual, of ghostly dimension, that it is instead exactly what happened here, which is also a lot because in the episode Herodotus gives his due to the magnificence of these enemies, to the fear, the greatness of these warriors. Remember that here we are very much at the peak of that sense of themselves that the Hellenists were fully developing against the Achaemenids, like the sense that now that was the true universal empire, and Athens had and her allies had the capacity to stand their ground and even win, and not even standing their ground, actually charging the enemy and breaking it. It's something enormous, amazing, right? Some things go wrong also for the Hellenists, but at large, we of course remember Marathon as this excellent episode, like in the Hellenic military chronicles of in the top, of course, of the first Persian War, so-called First Persian War. Notably, Herodotus, and this is again the most important tactical aspect of the battle, does not mention Achaemenid cavalry. This would simply imply, if you look at the account, that none were actually utilized, at least in the battle's initial phase, or at all. However, a relief currently housed in Brescia, northern Italy, represents a copy of a Hellenic painting showing an Achaemenid horseman during the war, suggesting that cavalry may have actually been involved, or at least that it would have been spotted by the Greeks during the campaign, but not having particularly participated to the Battle of Marathon, or if so, not having at least the capacity to break the infantry frontally, which at this point sort of makes sense because the Greeks were on average heavier than their counterparts, and cavalry did not really have any more that central role compared to this tougher infantry that also, in fact, from the Achaemenids to privilege cavalry. They may have not made use of this extensively at the Battle of Marathon for either strategical reason. Again, they needed that forage elsewhere because this was a hell of an army logistically, and or because of the terrain or whichever reason. It's also worth mentioning that the Achaemenid army was in fact divided. Right, part of their forces was located on the nearby island of Agylias, stationed to guard the prisoners intended for Darius. So it's possible that the Achaemenid forces were not even that overwhelmingly superior to the Greeks. At large, they were formidable foes, and especially their tactical diversity leading to combined arms was what the Greeks rightfully feared the most. So to enucleate just the battlefield, the army deployment, you have from the Greek side the two wings with 4 tribes on 8 ranks on both, and then the center with 2 tribes on 4 ranks. It can be speculated that the Plataeans were deployed on the leftmost end of the line, and they weren't so overwhelmingly important, but they added up to the numbers. Whereas the Achaemenids can be considered as being deployed with this division in the center of 10,000 spearmen, preceded by 2,000 Scythian archers, and having also on the wings this force of 4 to 5,000 hoplites of Achaemenid troops, right? Which is a fair estimate, right? And it's perhaps maybe a bit too in favor of the Persians, but we don't have to think that also literally all the Greeks were this overwhelmingly prepared troop, right, for the task. So things balance each other out overall. Now, it's possible, as I was hinting at before, that the Achaemenid forces were more, because we do not really have a clear idea of how many troops could have been there to begin with. Especially, we may think that there were, say, 2 lines. If the Achaemenids had this strong numerical advantage, they could have opted for 2 different battle lines deployed in depth, because they said, okay, well, the first one is enough to sort of at least crush them, or at least if we lose the encounter, they would be exhausted. With the second one, we can simply steamroll them. We are overall historically sure that the Achaemenid forces were not counting more than 20,000 men. So overall, we think of 15,000. I think it's fair, right? A bivalve of Artisbara spans 900 to 1,000 meters of terrain, with an additional 450 meters required for the flanks occupied by either 4,000 allied hoplites or 5,000 Persians, equivalent, by the way, to half a bivalve. So it's still a significant force, aligning them with the Hellenic phalanx front that, as we've seen, is pretty stretched in width, exactly to meet likely this larger amount of troops. So we can make the equation not just from the logistical basis of the triremes, but also looking at the same extent of the Hellenic line, knowing that it matched essentially the Persian one, and knowing more or less what was the Achaemenid army organization and the general composition of the expedition, coming to this overall conclusion. How distant were the 2 hosts when the battle began? Given the spaces, the surrounding territory, the nature of terrain, it's likely that the gap between the 2 hosts was approximately 1.5 kilometers. The 8 stadia that Herodotus discusses as well. This matches, in fact, the same source, is compatible, but especially it's very meaningful for understanding the battle. Remember, the Greeks, by Herodotus saying, performed this unprecedented feat of charging the enemy, and not just, like, say, in the sense that they managed eventually to defeat him, but that they had defeated it in function of their army cohesion that had not been lost even during such hasty advance, right? Remember, the enemy has archers, it is quite mobile. What the Hellenes must do in order to increase their chances of victory is covering this distance as quickly as they can. However, without losing cohesion, which is crucial to the wall thing, right? They understood the more they remain exposed to the enemy fire, the more they would have been damaged, but also from a psychological point of view, they would have been intimidated. Instead, like the broader anxiety is exploited by this incredibly hasty and also exhausting advance, because remember, the depleted panoply, especially at this point, is quite heavy, right? And it's really the guys in the front with the heavier equipment that really are the file opener, and that basically the cohesion of the unit rests on. And of course, you have to do this without losing the same order, right? And it's extremely difficult. As we've seen, it's a very wide line that is thus very likely to break, right? And that is extremely dangerous. I explained 3,000 times that the normal gaps between the various subunits of a battle lines are tactically ininfluent. Actually, they're necessary to maintain the cohesion of the same line, because units must need a minimal space to adjust themselves. The notion that enemy units would be defeated by entering the gaps between the units, it's complete BS. It never happened in any military history. And first of all, it does not provide with any advantage to the defender that would have to squeeze itself in, like losing his own cohesion just to do what. And the only way you find gaps being exploited in battle lines in a successfully tactical sense is, of course, when the line breaks. Not in the sense that you're gonna pick the single small lines, right? What happens later is that an entire section of the line will crumble, and so you can pour that in. This mostly happens in battles like the center. Like it literally actually happened at Marathon with the Greeks, even before they won on the wings, or with the wings. And so it has nothing to do with the minutiae of small unit tactics that people fixate with, because they are chicken-brained and they think that warfare has to do with the little things and not with the bigger ones. Now, by the way, the military historical analysis provides us, ancient sources or any source about warfare tells us pretty straightforwardly that nobody gave a damn about things like what kind of weapons you use or this kind of minutiae, but what single battle lines did, right? And so what the macroscopic dimension of leadership and morale was actually about, and massive maneuvering, not the smaller things. Now, the Hellenes, as we've seen in Herodotus, and this is very famous at Marathon, bridged the distance with the Achaemenids remarkably fast. First marching at double time and then sprinting for the final 100 to 200 meters, which is actually exhausting, right? And think here even about, as we've seen, this post-traumatic stress disorders, like what it meant. We know from battles normally that people died just out of exhaustion, right? They collapse. It's also very easy to do. You can easily kill yourself in that way. The people literally died dehydrated. It may sound like BS, but they literally died on the spot because they had consumed all the liquids they had to remain functional human beings. You had all this kind of psychophysical dimension next to the to the actual wounds and major physical traumas, right, that are crucial and that enormously influence the balance of moral forces. This aspect, by the way, must have been frightening for the same Achaemenids that, as we've seen, wanted to prevent. They put the screen of missile troops, hoping just to keep the enemy at bay, to break a little bit this advance. But the Greeks, a bit because of anxiety, a bit because they are actually good at maintaining the line, a bit because they're lucky, manage to maintain enough cohesion during the advance to smash into the enemy lines. So the enemy heavy infantry, and as we'll see now, fighting for a long time. This after the advance that would have been this again 1.5 kilometers would have been covered in about 15 minutes, right? Greece in even late summer, in the morning. We don't know about the weather, but in general, like in hoplitic armor is not just a walk, picking flowers. This is terrifying, right? Just this advance would have been basically most of how the battle would have been balanced by in the odds, even before the hand-to-hand fighting began. So the Greeks had to be extremely focused, and it's very difficult to stay focused when you're under such a great pressure. So certain glorious military historical pages are written also by factors that we do not know how to quantify, and that likely the same participants to this advance would have not really been able to assess in the moment, right? And also just being able to mythologize instead, like later. But what happened at large was understood that the phalanx had managed to advance at double speed, which had never been tried before, and maintaining its cohesion to go on winning against the enemy. The potential for disarray within the phalanx was considerable, and the last dash especially may have not been foreseen, may have just been the product of this exasperation, of this, like, if we don't charge now, if you remember that hoplitic warfare was actually a lot about this punch, right? And the entire history of the hoplitic heresy is this notion that this battle lines would have been so orderly, granitic, people would have been just always compressed against one another, the autismos, etc. But we don't think that was actually an overwhelming distinction from other type of heavy infantry forces at this point. If not, the precautions that an amatorial force would have taken in their way to maintain that cohesion. For the rest, like, combat is combat. Like, humans will still fight that way. And of course, any loss in cohesion, at least in that last sprint, was offset by a gain in momentum, which you do need also against the enemy lines. So it is really crucial. It's likely that the Achaemenids were already in position, prepared to meet the Hellenists. There is no indication here that the Persians, in a strictly tactical sense, were not prepared to meet the enemy. They were lined up. If anything, they may have missed their cavalry, as we'll see better later, but that was a given at that point. They were not taken by surprise in that, and so they would have also thought their formation in advance because of that possibility. So there are different hypotheses of how this battle went, as it's the case for any kind of engagement that we know so few about. And so people think that there is always the squaring of the circle, and that there is actually the deep, true explanation behind it, just the true great military story, and we'll find no, right? If you do not know how it went by those factors, you can only make different hypotheses by playing with the range of those factors and by using them in different combinations. Of course, not too much would have changed as a whole, but it's important to stress that different historians have all their own way of dealing with these inconveniences. And so as I analyze in relation to the Marathon campaign, I postulate that the Achaemenids aimed for a battle of disengagement, one that essentially would enable their forces to retreat to the sea with minimal losses following the indecisive standstill imposed on the Greeks at Marathon. This is important again because, as we said before, the Achaemenid mooring was also particularly chosen in that way. And likely, again, decompression against the Great Marshes would have been a preemptively defensive measure not to allow the same Hellenes to simply, swing whip the entire beach, swinging like a door, right, and overwhelming the entire beachhead and the landing area, right. And in fact, again, we'll see it. The most intense engagements apparently happened exactly over there, as the Greeks had by then lost cohesion, as the enemies had also routed, but still had this escape route in some sort of even pre-orderly fashion, which is interesting and important also in highlighting the Achaemenid skills in the art of war. The element of surprise was likely significant, especially because the hoplites quickly crossed no man's land, reducing their exposure to Achaemenid arrows. Right, this is, if anything, the most incalculable, or at least single factor that would have mostly amazed the Persians. The fact that they thought of the Hellenes to be just yet another barbarian people at the fringes of the world that had no capacity just to maintain their battle line in an effective way, especially in an advance that could surprise the Persians for such speed. And so they said, okay, we'll just bog them down as they advance, because they can't maintain cohesion just like that. And because, of course, we would have other Greeks within the same Persian army that would also likely think the same. Again, what the Athenians and Plataeans did at Marathon is probably something that they wouldn't believe even themselves after it was accomplished. So chapeau to them, but still remember that not everything is preemptively granted. The Hellenes, by the way, would have used again the tactics of crossing the distance between the two hosts at speed in battle at the Battle of Cunaxa, 401 BC. So it's something that, as you understand from just military logic, was not much of an option. Right, we tend to see these battles at times. Oh my God, there were so many different tactics that could ever be used, or especially it was so difficult to understand, what to do in that sense. It wasn't really, in a theoretical sense. Everything seemed clear, right? It's just today's people that do not understand these military fundamentals. What is even harder is to actually implement that, which is truly the point in the art of war. What kind of troops do you have in order to perform this? Again, an Hellenic phalanx at large is not very well designed in classical times to perform these maneuvers. It's at large not conceived for that, and it lacks some fundamental abilities to repeat that in a uniform pattern. So again, what happened at Marathon is really not a miracle, but almost. And it must be appreciated for it, because it was done, right? It's not about rolling the dice, right? You must enact that, and the Hellenes succeeded. By the way, Herodotus does not highlight this aspect too much, right? According to the Hellenic historian, what truly astonished the Persians, mirroring the surprise of the Hellenes themselves, was rather, and this is a tribute to, of course, Clausewitzian centrality of moral forces, the bravery and tenacity of the Athenians. Why? Because, of course, what mattered the most was what happened in combat, right? The necessity of arriving as a functional battle line to the Achaemenid one was just the precondition for the battle to be fought, right? But it was yet to be fought. And, of course, that was the crucial moment, right? And this is what really Herodotus cares about. And we tend to, and I, honestly, as a medievalist, I find it very often in battle accounts. What really the historians cared about is not really what kind of tactic was used, again, even less what kind of weapons were employed. It's all about this, like, who was the best at fighting, who held on the most, who really, was more aggressive, who really showed like the higher moral ground in combat. This is what it's really all about. It's not a set of deterministic preconditions. There are some preconditions for, as we've seen right now, for combat to happen in the first place, but what it really gets down to is how these people fight, right? And in fact, the will they have to kill the person in front of them, which is really what all warfare is deep down about. Now, the Athenians, Herodotus says, as we read before, were the first among all the Hellenes, as far as we know, to withstand the sight of the Median attire and the men wearing it. Prior to that, even hearing the name of the Medes had instilled terror in the Hellenes. Psychological aspect, remember, connected with a guy that literally passes out in the moment which he witnesses this enemy, this enormous guy, enormous shield and beard, and that strikes dead like the guy next to him. These were the kind of reputation different peoples had at the time, and so encountering that in combat, remember, this is the army of the King of Kings. These Persians ruled the world as far as the Hellenes know from their relatively provincial background. And the fact that somebody could simply face them and not being scared, even of just what these guys looked like, that, remember, had an enormous load of traditional and spiritual meaning, exactly in that imperial Catholic dimension, is what really determines a great deal of the moral forces that will be manifest in combat. This is crucial to understand. So the battle commenced fiercely. The Achaemenids, having replaced the Scythian skirmishers in the center, gained an advantage over the Athenians, because as we've seen, they had a major numerical advantage in the center over the very thin Athenian line. So much so that, quite straightforwardly, Herodotus says, the Athenian center collapsed. The central tribes constituting the Athenian center in the battle line break. This is incredibly relevant because it shows you what happens in all the greater engagements. That is, the odds are very balanced. As we've seen, the Athenians prevail now at the same time on the wings, but their center is gone, which is not really a good place to be in, right? And yet, like, the balance along the entirety of the front line is, in fact, still to be decided. In fact, on the flanks, while the center was breaking, the Hellenes instead overwhelmed their foes, driving them into flight instead. This is also remarkable because you would say, but then, well, why would the Hellenes win? Like in the military logical explanation of the well, if say they broke the wings and the enemy had broken their center, why would eventually the Greeks prevail, not the Persians? Well, because the Greeks have a much more compactly concentrated force to drive into the enemy and to reach the mooring. So the sense is that actually still things have to be fought out, but that let's say having both flanks broken and the enemy just reversing itself into the only exit that you have from there is sort of a problem. And Herodotus notes that the battle lasted a long time. This is also a very important statement because it should be interpreted in the context of hoplite combat durations. It is said, again, because the story of the hoplite heresy is that there is an almost stereotypical sense of what an hoplitic battle is. And in fact, if you check every single hoplitic battle that historically happened, none of them are actually that model, right? They do not fit it perfectly. However, there is a tendency towards this kind of say characteristic, including the fact that hoplitic battles would last usually for a relatively short time. Why? Because these people didn't kill each other. Was just able, they were just able just to push one another and say disarticulate the enemy line, and it would be decided. So he said, no, it's mostly because these troops were amateurs, right? And amateurs are not properly going to war in order just to last too long, right? And they are essentially militia, if you want to be concrete. Not even the Spartans that here are not in sight are technically at best trained in a semi-professional way, right? They're the best within the Hellenic war, but they're not really like, full-time professional warriors, as some would like to depict them. Say, I don't know, the Celts or the Italics or the Achaemenids themselves, much more warlike in many ways. All these infantries from the Iranian plateau are pretty darn good. Like, they're actual tribal warriors of sort. Here, what the Hellenes have from their side is also some kind of, you could argue, intellectual edge, in the sense that they had began to sort out their own civilization in ways that were unprecedented in history for all a series of reasons. It's not like they don't feel themselves warriors to a degree. They just don't pursue that specific lifestyle because it's too aristocratic in nature. But the Polis themselves have still this sense that of not of war band, in fact, but still of people that, as we've seen, were blessed by freedom in arms. These were citizen fighters rather than soldiers, because they weren't quite paid for that. But they emerged from a time in history in which all these cultures were warlike in a way or another. Just the Hellenes had to make more sense now of their popular regimes in a way that would emphasize the collective effort and organization, and belonging to these single polis that would give each other a tough time to in fact build each other up in the process, but also for a type of combat that was very confined. In fact, we explained now how the same Achaemenids had bigger plans in mind, and they're tough. Like, it's not like the European infantries are weak at whole. They are actually superior to the ones we see in the Levant on average. The same Achaemenids would have had like very strong picked troops, but at large, yes, individually they're good. As we just said, they're warlike, surely superior to hand-to-hand combat to the Greeks, but not much in collective training. For a number of reasons that lay into the essentially like feudal mindset of the Achaemenid world, that is also very cavalry loaded, that does not spend too much resources for large bodies to train large bodies of infantry, which means they can't field actually lots of them given the size of their empire. To a degree, they would have some level of collective training was minimal for say the satisfactory standards. But that was different, in fact, compared to the one that now the Hellenes are developing, especially for infantries that are much more taken care of. If anything, they're not better, necessarily even better trained. The Achaemenids actually have better combined arms tactics. They can perform maneuvers that the Greeks can only dream of, but they're heavy, and they are, again, also spirited by this sense of cohesion with one another, like fighting people that they know, that they live together with, etc. And so we're in front of that balance that allows, especially the Greeks here, to concentrate their force, like exploiting their own strength in a context that, in fact, we do not really understand much from the other side, because we have too few information about the Persian army in this specific context. But it's relevant for Herodotus that this fight at Marathon had lasted actually longer than the average. Like after about an hour only, like a hoplite would typically be fatigued, considering also they wouldn't fight literally all the time, because they would mostly clash and distance themselves. So actual combat lasted not even a few minutes, really. So that when an entire enemy formation collapses, and also you want to chase the fugitives because you're not really coordinating yourself with the rest of the army at that point. You're just, again, it's already a lot you've managed to maintain coherent during the advance. You wouldn't even see the other end of the line. You would want to also to just win your prize, as we've seen that guy that gets himself killed by the ships we have mentioned from Herodotus. That level of discipline, collective discipline, in fact, is not really there. And this is also what the Hellenists pay for. But imagine, again, fighting for, say, 1 hour, or at least fighting this at intervals for 1 hour still, with all the adrenaline, all the stress, all the kind of things that you will see, and even lose your sight for, like literal psychological shock blindness, with heavy armor on. Again, there were lighter troops in the posterior rank, but this doesn't really make it better for the guys who wear heavy armor, because, again, the brunt of the effort will be placed on them. And so this stresses them even further. And this is, as we said before, the force over which, like, the majority, like, all the rest, basically relies on. Despite spending a quarter of an hour in intense marching and an analogous length of time in combat, the victorious Hellenic flanks refrained from really pursuing their fleeing foes at large. However, like, they were exhausted. Part of the reason is also that, right? So some groups, like, are uncoordinated, and overall it's a still difficult situation. However, they maintain sufficient control and awareness to reorganize on the spot and focus on attacking now the Achaemenid center. Because we also don't know how this really happened, right? But it was an important maneuver that, while complicated for a hoplite phalanx, was executed so effectively that it led to victory. As we were answering the question before about, like, why would eventually, like, the Achaemenids give way if, say, they had broken the Hellenic center, is that the Hellenic wings do not really only threaten, of course, the general escape routes of the, especially of an Achaemenid force that wants to go ahead because of their unavoidable connection with the ships, but they can also maneuver against their flanks, right? And again, it's complicated because, as it's often the case, an overwhelming of the right flank frequently occurs spontaneously and typically results into an encirclement to which hoplites are somehow accustomed. However, performing a similar maneuver on the left flank was unprecedented, for example. And this depended on the general asymmetry of Hellenic formations. I mean, the fact that these were amateurs, the fact that the shield was, as you know, like, this very important element of the panoply, to the point of even, like, giving the sense of security from the left side and pushing, in fact, the wall formation to the right, for which you had to station tougher men there to hold this drift. it's also affecting the type of wheeling you can perform with these units. Right? It's much easier in that sense to wheel on the right, but wheeling on the left is instead difficult. And so there you have the Greeks maintaining enough cohesion to perform this maneuver orderly. Otherwise, it would have not really worked. Right? What, of course, we see here that breaking the enemy means that he will actually rout. So you are praising, you're treasuring that cohesion you have maintained, and you understand how precious it is. And so if you see that things are going badly, like in this case in the center, you will try to use your forces to attack the enemy from the flank accordingly. So the clash resumed with the Hellenists enjoying a notable tactical advantage, ultimately leading them to victory as they pursued the Achaemenids to their ships. We, again, don't know too much about this whole passage. As we've seen, even this attack on the flanks is not really well outlined. Some scholars do not even really point out the actual wing collapse, but Herodotus at least specifies that the wings were victorious, and so in a way or another this would have really happened. If this analysis of the overall sort of deployment and maneuvering is accurate, approximately 10,000 Persians were engaged against 8,000 to 9,000 Greeks who had surged upon their flanks. Before being ensnared, the Achaemenids broke. We do not even know exactly how long they put up a resistance before breaking. Again, it's possible that even just a general situation brought them to break, because normally if you are outflanked, even before the enemy falls on you in that situation from both sides, it's going to be, especially with this, you see, because the Hellenic forces were also more concentrated. They were uncoordinated, but they had, especially the left, this instinct of attacking on the right. And if especially now they're capable of wheeling, and the Achaemenids can't simply do that because also they would have still another enemy unit at that point on their own rear from the other side. They would simply give way, or actually, as we explained before, like perform a withdrawal, which is unlikely. Mostly they broke, but still, like in a way, they would have expected and disposed also their troops for in relation, especially to the ships. This is the moment in which the Greeks advance rapidly in the Achaemenid wake, and this is the dangerous moment. This is the moment in which the cohesion of the entire force is a bit broken. Again, the Hellenists would maintain a greater one than the routing Persians, but still we understand from Herodotus that a lot of hand-to-hand combat happened again, and so this shows that the Achaemenids were somehow capable still of fighting during their retreat. This pursuit, by the way, left a significant mark on the memory of the Athenians. For example, there's this other source we haven't read today, but they are later sources, like the description of Greece. You have Pausanias describing a celebratory mural that illustrates this segment of the battle in Athens, while Aristophanes, in his comedic work The Acarnanians, mentions that the veterans of Marathon only needed to say we were in pursuit to convey the profound impact of the battle, especially to the younger generation, which also suggests again that possibly like there wasn't even that enormously complex maneuvering that we may imagine. Especially if the enemy breaks and gives way, that's it. At least Aristophanes would seem to suggest that there was a great deal of chasing rather than else. it's obvious that the Athenians must have dedicated themselves to this chase, having run and fought, expending their remaining physical and emotional energy to catch up with the Achaemenids, especially their triremes, as they approached the shore. Because the point here was finishing off the entire expedition, and if the ships were there, the Hellenes could sort of ravage them, hadn't the Persians properly put up a resistance. We're not that informed about the dread, however, that was surely present among the Achaemenid lines. I mean, they had been broken, the battle was over, and now they had to run for their lives and, say, embark under enemy pressure without even a proper order. So it was pretty messed up. The Persians were, however, this is an interesting point, less fatigued, as lightly armed, like lightly posed a challenging target, especially for exhausted hoplites. Nevertheless, it's also true that in these situations, like many of them would have been slain during the retreat anyway. When you lose cohesion, it's all just being mowed down. It doesn't matter what kind of armor you wear, whatever. Yes, you can run faster, but you would have been struck from a psychological point of view as well. And at some point, people just let themselves being killed. That's how it really happens. When they're mentally broken, which is the first thing, it happens when you're out, when it's over in that sense. It's also likely that some Achaemenids drowned in the great marsh behind them. However, Hellenic casualties were also significant, with the polemarch Callimachus himself and numerous notable Athenians losing their lives. While attempting to reach the ships to set them ablaze, Callimachus had commanded like one of the wings. So we're talking about like a ferocious fight of some sort. And the Athenians try to damage the Persians as much as they can, but they also turn back at a point. The Athenians had pursued the fleeing Achaemenids, killing them until they reached the shore, where they tried to fire the ships. And this creates contradictions surrounding their intention, by the way, to capture ships while igniting them, raising questions about how one could resort to fire in that scenario unless, as I propose, part of the Achaemenid camp and its fires were situated near the shore close to the fleet's landing area. In fact, if you really look at the map overall, you realize that the Persian camp needed some broader space to be established. And here in the pictures, in the maps I used, it's not present, but I could even add it tomorrow. But it would have been located just at the westernmost, like the end of the marshes, right on the left, rather than up east, like at the end of when there is the peninsula, where there's also a little lake, because otherwise you can't find an actual space. And this would have allowed the Persians essentially to retreat in the camp and still protect their ships, right? Allowing people to, say, defend this camp temporarily and then to get into the ships. This also really, like if you look at the picture, you realize that while it's true that this terrain is somehow more open than the otherwise like rugged Hellenic hinterland, it's not really a great terrain for cavalry, right? So the real issue here seems to have been where to deploy cavalry, and we do know that cavalry was there at the beginning of the operations, but it's not here during the battle, right? And so this Herodotus had talked about the famed Achaemenid cavalry, and here we do not find it, if not in a reduced measure. At least it's evidently not an element that is mentioned in Herodotus' battle account, right? So some think that, for example, cavalry had already been embarked in the hours before the battle, but it's a bit unlikely, right? This would have been also something that the Greeks could have not simply foreseen. More likely, Achaemenid cavalry would have gone somewhere else, of searching for forage in the hinterland, and at that point, it would have not the cavalry would have not been there, right? So there is another possibility, that is the time for cavalry deployment. That is to say, if the Achaemenid cavalry was embarked at night, for example, in the ships, which is a possibility, considering the narrow sort of spaces at large. And the fact that some of the triremes, as we've seen, would have been the same stables, essentially, through which cavalry would have been shipped to Greece, together with probably the adequate space for the same horsemen. So even because it was a very precious element of the army, so you may have not sort of compressed everything into the camp that, as we've seen, doesn't even have all this enormous protection. It's possible that the Greeks attacked in the morning before the Achaemenid cavalry was actually disembarked, which would have taken some time. It would have happened every day, but for that reason, the Greeks may have actually known the timing and not allowed for, in fact, its deployment in time for the battle, right? This is an explanation about the lack of at least multiple explanations for the lack of the cavalry. Herodotus does not discuss it. Nevertheless, it's overall positive that it wasn't like a major element in his account, mostly because of its absence, and it exemplifies also how, say, subjective sources can be, not because they are telling something false, but because they are, say, just neglecting some aspects. I mean, it was much more important for Herodotus to say that the Achaemenids won this respect for the Athenian fighting skills than saying, I don't know, their cavalry was not there, so we actually won in part because of that. You know, it sort of makes sense. You see, history never truly lies to you, right? It's always about a relative fairness about the whole, even when the accounts are incomplete, like in terms of the full picture information. And even when they lie, they actually say something that sort of makes sense as a whole, or at least highlights certain aspects that may still contain the truth, and that you have to be able to catch. Also consider that these were texts that other people read, so you couldn't, in a much more public and choral and collective way than, I don't know, a guy in his diary that would hope someone would find later, so that nobody would know, and that future people would reconstruct this battle in ways that he could manipulate. No, right? These sources were extremely popular and borderline official, essentially, meaning that these really contain the memory of that community, say, exploit that nobody could lie about, because everybody knew how that they had gone. They would have been talking forever about this. So that's why we have especially to trust sources first and scholarship later. Scholars, as we've seen, do not come always up with the right explanation. Now, Herodotus does not record any ships being destroyed by fire. Instead, he noted that only 7 triremes of a much larger fleet were captured. Other vessels escaped unscathed, as the Hellenes, satisfied with their performance and weary from running approximately 5 to 6 kilometers and engaging in significant fighting, either halted their pursuit or could not reach the ships in time. which would be explained especially by the Achaemenid camp location that would have sort of also broken at least most of their originary battle formations. Alternatively, the arrival of the Achaemenid cavalry may have compelled the Hellenists to hastily retreat. This is yet another possibility, but it's a bit more, at least, you see, Herodotus is all we have, so we don't have to, we can speculate, but we don't really know. The count of 7 captured triremes also provides insight into the scale of the Achaemenid losses, of course, which Herodotus states amounted to 6,400 men. Now, scholars are generally skeptic of this high losses, especially in comparison to only the 192 Hellenic ones that Herodotus mentions. In fact, there is a mathematical trick here, that is to say, if you multiply 192 by 33.3, it results in 6,400, suggesting that Achaemenid fatalities were likely far greater than those suffered by the Hellenists, but in a way that is a bit numerically ideal, and that the Hellenic historian may have actually inflated and say, for one guy that we lost, the enemy lost 30. Well, when you look at, say, 6,400 seems excessive, right? When you look at, for example, the loss of let's focus for a moment on the triremes. As we've seen, one had a crew of about 200 men. It could accommodate 30 to 40 hoplites, right? Meaning that if 7 triremes had been captured, you would have had something between 900 and 1,400 infantry and sailors left stranded on land and likely killed. Which, of course, does not take into account the combat losses that are generally much more contained ones during the rout that we also do not really know how to quantify. But that may have been reduced due to this capacity of the Achaemenids to retreat in their own camp, to have this further fighting next to the ships. So some scholars have used this baseline for estimating Persian losses. You should consider that combat casualties and those who died during the pursuit would increase just a bit, so that there seemingly wasn't a massive rout, at least a massive pursuit from the Hellenic side, because again, you have no cavalry. The enemy retreats at your similar speed or even more, because they're generally lighter. They have the camp there. You find where you should meet them, and you even take casualties there. So there's not like the full picture in which you simply mow the enemy down for kilometers with superior mobile forces, and at the end of the day you just exterminate everybody that escapes, right? Herodotus just tells us that just most Achaemenid ships were saved, and so this Achaemenid force at large would have had all the time to be able to embark and save themselves, save their skins. So some people say the Achaemenid army suffered 1,600 losses or so, like 1/10 of the forces involved, let's say. It's possible that there were more, right? We do not really know about it. It's plausible. I would subscribe to that, because already a guy out of 10 in a world force is not a few, right? But it's possible that there were more. It's possible that at large, otherwise, you see, the Achaemenids were fully retreating. It's not like they had many chances to simply stand their ground once again had they simply entrenched themselves into their positions, they would have been able to resist. I mean, they would have maybe attempted something to resist, because they lost just one guy out of 10. And so, if just as few as 7 Achaemenid ships were lost, because we don't see others being actually set on fire, regardless even of the Hellenic wish, we can think still that this was a full rout of some sort, at least in a way that the Achaemenids didn't think to put up a further fight. And this makes sense. It would have made sense in any case, even if hadn't they taken particularly heavy losses, but just had they had their army broken right from the original battle formation. So it's a bit of a mystery. And yeah, let's say 1600 death. The Athenian fatality rate is relatively low, just under 2%, as noted by Herodotus, who does not provide figures for the Plataeans, by the way, especially compared to the average 5% observed in victorious hoplite battles. It's unlikely that Herodotus erred in these figures, as the deceased were well-known individuals. One could attribute the outcome of the Battle of Marathon to mere luck, especially if you consider the mysterious role of the Achaemenid cavalry. It's likely absence on the field, so that the Hellenes would have triumphed due to fortunate circumstances. However, it's clear that the initial troop formation and the double maneuver retreating inland are not typical tactical strategies for a phalanx. All doubts and hypotheses are valid, of course, leaving it to you to assess the roles of courage, skill, and luck in this context. The events before and after the battle, of course, are another story, as we've seen also in the account. The Achaemenids embark and try to essentially catch the Athenians by surprise by passing Cape Sunion and trying to seize the same Athens. So even if they weren't totally destroyed or something, was a desperate move in a way, but still a dangerous one. So again, many question marks in many ways, but also some general assessments about the capacity of the Hoplitic phalanx to really perform a relatively ordered maneuver that otherwise would have really not been tried, hadn't the same Greeks been so pressured by the circumstances. Here in the pictures that I used, it's all sort of more I don't know, because I had this, I should search, because now the pictures I use are always from Wikimedia Commons. Let's see if there is some better, well, I should do this later, but I lengthened the video a little bit as usual. See if there is a better picture about the Battle of Marathon, better map about the Battle of Marathon, because so it fits a bit better the narrative that we've given. By the way, the one of for example, there is, I think these are the maps from West Point. They're wrong. It's actually terrible to think that, this one is nice, maybe. I don't know, this is also wrong compared to our estimate. And yes, you have this wrong picture, and yeah, no, I think I will be using this once, because at this, I mean, conceptually you've seen probably, if I really use them, these wings closing themselves on the rear of the Persians. At that point they would have cut them out from the camp or whatever. instead there ain't such a thing. And yeah, it's plenty of mistakes. You see, if one just reads the sources and looks at the maps, they don't make this mistake. Right, everything again is debatable for battles of this kind because it's all really so unknown, and you have just one source. But at large, the dynamic is relatively clear, and if you make all the kind of equation with the logistical say logistical effort, strategic aims, what general precautions these forces would have taken before the battle, everything seems sort of more normal, right? I will try here to maybe I'll add the camp or something if I have time. Otherwise, it's not such a crucial issue. I just don't want to really be that I could even skip the well, whatever, no, don't worry, this is just my problem what kind of pictures I'm going to provide you with, but for the rest it's overall alright. For well, this is part also of our Persian Wars series, by the way, that we have been gradually completing. I don't know how much, there are so many battles actually that we should discuss, but it was one of the first we started back in the day on Schwerpunkt, and it seems to me that was also one of, people don't watch it too much. I don't understand why, but these are such important battles, like in the history of mankind, that you must forcibly pass, even just for building a military historical culture true, because they illustrate in a way that paradoxically you don't find with the same historiography, of course, across the years. Most of, say, the rest of Western sources, started from the Hellenic, from Hellenic historiography, telling the past by imitation, style, general criticism, etc. But it's just at this time that you have that comprehensive explanation. And again, Marathon is the beginning of it all. In many ways, with Herodotus as the first significant battle that is actually described in this level of, say, criticism and analysis. But it's also the beginning, in fact, of a specific season that is classical Hellenic warfare that, again, has such many privileged standpoints from which you can analyze it. That is really that cool. Okay, I think the map is cool. Yeah, I don't think that we will need many additions. And so, I don't know, let me check how many videos I made on Hellenic warfare, because again, it's really important. I'm planning, by the way, to at some point some branches of the cycle, as you know, die out, and so I substitute them with others that eventually can create a bit more of context, right? And this would happen before I finish the Hellenic War. 33 videos. God, it's not that bad. We made really we're gonna talk about lots of interesting things. Come on, it's very interesting. Made again a video about the Marathon campaign, a strategic analysis. You can check that out. And it was a very old video. 2 hours and 41. Now, yeah, made lots of interesting battles. We talked really about that was a nice picture that I could use for the I have it, like the beach, yeah, ships at Marathon. That exactly the image that you've also seen here. And we've been improving, and we've made again battles that I'm interested in. Admittedly, not getting too many views, but well, okay, it's a moderate one. The more we make, the more we increase in this sense, and I'm glad about it. I was glad to talk about Marathon once again. It's one of those battles you can't unsee, right? I don't know about how much criticism I will make after this about other references, yes, but let's say how much can you discuss after a video like this about the Battle of Marathon? Of course, lots of things, lots of aspects about the historical background, the general narrative, but at large, more or less what we know here is what we really get from a tactical point of view. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.